couple minutes past the hour, so we can go ahead and get started, officially kick this thing off. So I'm Eric Dodds. I lead customer success at RudderStack, which we'll talk a little bit about that tool in the context of the webinar. But today what we're going to talk about is the Datasack journey. So we have a really exciting guest, Alex, who you've already heard me bantering with, and we'll dig into his background a little bit, but wanted to give a quick overview. So the Datasack journey is really about how, in the age of data proliferating inside of an organization, the data that's collected and produced by an organization, one of the big challenges that businesses face is all of the effort, processes, and tooling that go into having a data stack that works across their company, across teams, and helps them build competitive advantage. Now, the challenge is that businesses change. And so what we're going to talk about today is how to architect a scalable stack. So what are the tools that you need to put together at various stages of growing a business relative to your customer data stack, and what does that look like through the life cycle of the business? And so here are the things we'll talk about. So we'll talk about why your data stack needs to be dynamic. We'll talk about a long-term view of the stack. So what are the problems that we typically see at scale? We'll talk about the stages of companies as we've broken them out. There's different ways to do that, but we put together a simple framework to walk through. And then we're going to talk through the tool set and cost at each stage of the business. Briefly touch on business models and how those influence the stack, and then we'll touch on things outside of the stack itself in terms of team structure and other stuff like that. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Alex, and you have a really interesting background as an engineer in several different contexts, but you are currently a consultant at Big Time Data, which I want to hear about. Before that, you were at Mattermost, and before that, you were at Heroku. And I wanted to point that out to the audience because you have a really interesting perspective. Heroku is a huge organization, of course, part of the Salesforce empire, and doing things at a massive scale. Mattermost is really a startup, right? Large, fast-growing startup, but sort of on the other end of the spectrum from Heroku. And now, as a consultant, you see all sorts of different. So, do you just want to give us a little bit of your background in your own words, and then we can dive into the content?
Perfect. Yeah. So prior to Heroku, I was basically like a full stack developer, front end, back end. I just like to do it all. I joined Heroku about 6 years ago, and that's sort of where my data engineering journey began. Like you touched on, the nice thing about Heroku was just like the scale of everything was bigger, like not only because you're part of, the Salesforce board, but also just Heroku itself had tons of data. I mean, they're processing just billions and billions. I can't even, the number is higher than billions. What's over billions? Trillions? I don't know. Many billions of requests per month. And so it's a pretty big scale there. And basically got into the data engineering stuff there, which at the time was very not good. We were still using like bash scripts, and our data warehouse was literally a Postgres database. I mean, it was a giant Postgres database with tons of memory and stuff, but like it was still just Postgres. So I ended up moving them to sort of a more modern data architecture, and I'll kind of touch on that later as well. And basically, about 14 months ago, we moved to Mattermost, and the idea was we're going to take everything that we learned at Heroku and just replay the playbook at Mattermost, which when we joined Mattermost, they literally had no data infrastructure at all, as many, Series A, Series B companies do. And so at Mattermost, we were able to build like their whole data stack, analytics stack, go-to-market automation and all this stuff that we built. And then now we've recently created our big time data consulting company because we saw like, hey, everybody has all these problems. they're all pretty similar. It's like, I think we can help all these different customers figure it out. And that's where sort of this idea of the data stack journey started to form in my head, because it's like, there's differences between talking to companies that are at like the seed stage or earlier versus, like a Heroku size or even a Mattermost size. There's some differences between how these companies are operating and like what their concerns are, and sort of, how do you build a data stack that allows, you to grow from a seed company to a Mattermost size company to the Heroku size company, and, beyond that.
Sure. Love it. Well, let's dig in and let's hear about that experience. So we'll just kind of go back and forth here. I think we've actually already touched on this. So I'll kind of intro it and then would love your thoughts on it based on what you just talked about in terms of the stages of a company. But really the question is, why does your data stack have to be dynamic? And I think the best way, as Alex and I were talking about this and prepping for the webinar, is if you even just think about the last 10 years, you had companies who adopted, at the time, amazing, basically on-prem, infrastructure to handle all their data stuff, right? And then in a relatively short amount of time, you have this massive migration to the cloud. And then, you sort of have the first wave of warehouses. And then the current phase is from early warehouse solutions to Snowflake. And so, Alex, do you want us to give a brief definition of the data stack journey in that context, right? We've seen a lot of stuff happening. We live in a great age as far as, tools and all that sort of stuff. But what is the data stack journey in a concise definition?
Yeah, I mean, I like the quote that we have there. I don't want to read it, so I'm not going to, but definitely take that into your mind when you're reading that. But, it's how do I start based on the size of my company and the number of customers and like the various things that would make you choose different things, like based on those, what tools should I pick? What technologies? How should I even, from an organizational perspective, organize like who owns what and where those things live? And then, how do I leverage all this stuff so I'm actually getting data out of it the whole time? And then how does my data stack sort of grow with me so that I'm not having to go back and do all this rework because I made the wrong decision, 5 years ago, and now I have to spend a year, rewriting everything to get to that next modern data stack.
Sure. Well, let's talk about the problems at scale. So this is something you've seen directly. And why don't we just walk through each one of these? I can give the brief explanation, and then why don't you talk about briefly the way that you've seen that play out at scale when it becomes a real issue. So internal tools become burdensome and costly to manage. We see this a lot where you're sort of evaluating tools and you say, we kind of have this a little bit more of a custom need. We're just going to build this data infrastructure ourselves. What does that look like when it becomes problematic at scale?
Yeah, so obviously, I think there's a few things. A is, can your custom solution actually like satisfy all the needs that you actually have for it? Like, can you actually execute and build that? A, and then B, it's like, well, now I have to, pay like these highly paid engineers to go build the thing. That takes time. And then it becomes like technical burden. I won't say debt because it could be amazing, but you know what I mean? It's like somebody has to know how to operate this thing. Somebody has to be monitoring this thing, make sure that it's working right. If the person who built it left or whatever, it's like, well, now they have to like train, and maybe they don't understand the full context, and just, there's just layers and layers and layers of it that really can kind of bite you. So I think like being able to, pull something off the shelf, and, I don't want to mention RudderStack already, but I think what's nice about RudderStack is just being like, having the data warehouse is like the center of it. It's like, okay, we're getting the data into the data warehouse, and now like, okay, I can control the data warehouse and I can like make everything work in there. So I can still build those like sort of custom things that maybe I thought I needed, elsewhere, but now it's just like, oh, it's in my data warehouse. I'm doing stuff with that all day.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, the way that we kind of refer to that a lot as there's a point at which you're building a product, like a data infrastructure product and that takes away focus from the product that you're building for the customers who are paying, right? Lack of unified data. I think this one's pretty simple, right? And everyone's experienced this. Data gets trapped in different silos, right?
Yeah.
So
and I think the worst iteration of this is when you have let's say you have Looker or some data visualization tool, and somebody goes and runs a report that says like, oh, this customer paid us XYZ amount of dollars last month. But then somebody else, some sales guy, goes into Salesforce and he's running his own reports in Salesforce, and it says, oh, he only gave us this much. And then now people are like, well, which one do I trust now? And the sales guys can be like, well, I like Salesforce, so I'm just going to trust Salesforce. And then the customer support person is looking at like a totally different view. So being able to, like, especially at big time data, like we really think about like getting that data into the data warehouse so that you can have those like real sources of truth that say, this is the real source of truth. And then using like reverse ETL to get that data to those other systems so that the data is consistent across all those systems. And then that means people are trusting the data, they're going to the right places for the data and all that kind of stuff.
Sure. Single view of the customer 360 are just buzzwords that are thrown around so much, but it really is a big challenge for companies it kind of stems from lack of unified data.
Yeah.
Right. And so you have problems around different versions of the same customer record, essentially.
Yeah. And I mean, I think everybody's trying to crack this nut, and I think a lot of people are not that good at it. And that's like something that we try to bring to our customers. And that's something that we built at Mattermost, is like, give us the customer 360 that can show you like, here's all like sort of the sales metrics about this customer. Here's all the customer support tickets and stuff like that. Here's the product usage stuff, all in one place where they can go and see that kind of thing. And yeah, like you said, like if you have all this stuff siloed around and, people are, again, using different views of the data, it just gets very unwieldy and it really inefficient, I think is the term, because then you have to have people running around trying to be like, well, what's the real answer to this question? Or,
Sure.
That kind of stuff.
So collection limitations due to cost is an interesting one. You want to briefly touch on that? And that's actually something that the very first time we talked, you brought up, and that was a problem you were solving in Mattermost.
Yeah, so when I joined Mattermost, they were using Segment at the time, and they had, because of the cost of Segment, they had to change their code to limit how much product data they were sending through Segment, because it was just becoming, like tens of thousands of dollars a month or something. And this was, a few years ago. So they were like, we can't be spending this for, because the marginal value of like one event really isn't that high. It's really when you get to that aggregate level and where you have enough data to make those, like, especially once you get to like the machine learning and, statistical modeling and stuff, it's like you need a lot of data to be able to get good stuff out of that stuff, and paying so much money just didn't work. So one of the first, after I basically built the foundation of the data infrastructure for Mattermost, the next thing to tackle was, well, what are we going to do to get more of this data? We need this data, and Segment isn't cutting it. And so that's where RudderStack came in. And, not to toot your guys' horn too much, but it was from an engineering perspective, it was a pretty seamless process to, get us transitioned over from Segment to RudderStack, which was really nice because, I'm kind of the new guy coming in being like, hey, engineers, you need to go do all this stuff. And, being able to say like, hey, here's exactly what you need to do. It's not really that complicated. And they were able to get it done. And I mean, I think we had it done in a couple of months. And honestly, most of that is just because Mattermost at the time had a release schedule that was only once a month. So I had to have like a big lead time to make sure it got into the release. But yeah, now now it's like anytime a product manager releases a new feature into the product, we're like, this doesn't go into the release unless it has telemetry associated with it. And we don't have to think about the cost of it. It's just like, yeah, you need the data. How are people using this feature that I'm implementing?
Sure.
You know, and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Well, let's tackle the last three together because I want to be conscious of time. But processing and transformation aren't abstracted and flexible, which leads to data quality issues. And then analytics ultimately becomes a cleanup team, not actually providing business insights. You just want to give us a brief overview of what does that problem look like and feel like at scale?
Yeah, well, I can tell you the analysts hate it. And that leads to some burnout and people leaving and stuff like that. I mean, yeah, so basically, if you can have, you know, and we'll get into DBT, which I will talk about at length. Just remember the name, and we'll get to it later. But you know, being able to have that centralized place, and where the analytics engineers and data engineers are the ones that actually like do all the logic, because they're the ones that are going to know the data across the organization better than anybody. And so they're the ones that are going to be able to combine it into actually useful models that can then be used by the rest of the organization outside of it. But if you have, like, you know, at Heroku, we had times where these marketing people, which nothing against marketing people, but they're not like SQL experts, right? Like they don't want to be, they're never going to be, right? And they're trying to like modify these SQL queries to, you know, give them, you know, their audience for some Facebook ad or whatever it is. And it does, like, A, it doesn't scale, B, it breaks down all the time, and then C, they come to the analyst team and they're like, hey, this doesn't seem to be working, can you help figure this out? And it's like, well, this is dumb, like you should have used one of these things we already had built or whatever. So yeah, that's definitely a big thing.
Sure. All right, well, let's quickly look. So those are some of the problems at scale that you've experienced at Heroku and Mattermost and seen in your consulting. Let's quickly talk about company stages. So I'll just run through these quickly. And I mean, these are pretty, you know, pretty straightforward to people, but you have the first step, right? So this is, you know, the proverbial company in a garage, or a couple of founders, they come up with a product and they do everything, right? They're doing sales, they're probably building the product, and are handling all of the business side of things as well. And usually the technology is pretty primitive, right? And the scale as well from this standpoint doesn't necessitate a lot of technology, right? When someone signs up for the product, you probably have, you know, terminal running on your computer and you can see the signups coming in, and you know, you're cheering every time that happens. As you grow, you go into the seed stage. Usually you're raising some money around here and building out teams, right? So the founders are still really involved, but you start to have teams that layer on additional technology. Usually this is going to be product team layering on technology for the product, whether that's, you know, analytics or other product tools. And then sales and marketing are most common, right? And this is where you start to see additional tools layered in, usually, again, pretty limited, right? Maybe some analytics tools and maybe some marketing and sales SaaS tools. But again, like, you know, fairly limited, and you're starting to do a little bit more advanced analytics. You have a little bit more data, but still lighter duty. Product market fit, that's a whole nother conversation for another time. That's but let's assume that you found product market fit, or you're in a stage where you're finding it and things seem to be working and you're growing quickly. You have thousands of customers. You know, of course, this depends on the business model, but you have a huge amount of volume. You're probably a couple million in revenue, and now I would describe this stage as you're starting to ask deeper questions about the business, both that are rearward looking, right? So how did we get here? And that are forward looking, right? How do we grow from here? How do we need to change? And that crosses multiple different vectors of the business, right? So if you're an e-commerce company, you're looking at products, product mix, user experience, all of those sorts of things. If you're a SaaS company, you're looking at product experience, activation. In both cases, you're heavily analyzing the marketing funnel and the customer journey. And then if you continue to grow, you get to the mature stage. So you're a big player in whatever industry you're operating in. And you're one of the main choices that people are going to. So now you're dealing with pretty significant scale. And here you're dealing with situations where data can move things a little bit, but that makes a huge difference to the bottom line, right? So we're talking about a 1% increase in number of activated users, having a massive change in the bottom line of the business. And the reality in today's world is you need a significant amount of clean data in order to understand how to create those optimizations. And then Alex's name for the last category, which I love, is your grandma's heard of them. And I think we'll just use a quick example of here. Netflix is sort of the classic example here, building literally some of their own tooling internally because they're facing problems of scale that have literally never been faced before because it's a new business model and new technology. Anything I missed there, Alex?
No, I think that's totally good. Totally good.
So we just wanted to cover these quickly because in terms of the Datasack journey, it's really important to understand the needs that you have at these different phases, right? Because there are challenges with layering on too much complexity too early, right? If you're seed stage, you don't need to be looking at building your own tooling like Netflix, right? But at the same time, if you're a mature company, you do need a pretty robust stack in order to meet the needs of the business from a data perspective. So let's quickly talk the core data components. I'll run again through these, and I know I'm talking, but then I'm going to hand it over to Alex, and you can take us on the journey, which is going to be the best part of the whole thing. Data warehouse. This is the center of the stack, and there are lots of things around the customer data stack that are related and connected to these things. But as Alex and I were preparing for this, we wanted to focus on the core pieces that every company needs. Not necessarily, the cloud SaaS applications that are commonly connected. So what are the core pieces of the data stack? So data warehouse, this really should be the center of the stack. Alex will talk about that. That means that all your data can both be collected in one place, but then accessible to both all the systems and technology and teams downstream. Data transformation, we talked a little bit about this earlier, as something that becomes a major problem at scale. In terms of sort of abstracting it and making it flexible. But this is really the process, like a business produces and collects all different types of data. And when it hits downstream destinations or is used in certain ways, it often needs to be in a different format or cleansed or changed in some way to be useful as it moves through the system. Visualization, this is simple, translates data really to be usable for humans, most often in analytics context, but all sorts of other ways as well. The event stream piece is getting user behavior data. So that's websites and apps. And of course, could be other things like point of sale systems, et cetera, but most commonly websites and apps. ETL, ELT, this term has been sort of a buzzword lately with the reverse component, but we'll call this sort of traditional ETL that pulls tabular data from a cloud app into your warehouse. That is what we're referring to there. Reverse ETL, which is the new kid on the block, sending data from your warehouse to apps and other destinations in the stack. Really cool. Very excited about that technology. And then data governance. And this is sort of a broad term, but for the sake of simplicity and time, we're sort of packaging a couple things in here. One would be keeping your data clean across the entire stack. And then also having an eye towards the security and privacy component. So again, that can mean different things, but we're sort of packaging it all up into one term for the sake of simplicity. So the moment we've all been waiting for.
Oh, baby.
Alex, take us on the journey. So we just started a company, you and I, and we're hammering on the product. What does our stack look like?
Yeah, so one thing to know about me is I'm a huge Postgres fanboy. So we're not using any MongoDB or MySQL. It's all Postgres. But that's just me.
Duly noted. Duly noted.
So
someone's going to comment about that at the end, by the way.
I know, right? So yeah, I mean, you're probably going to have one production database, right? The Amazon Aurora or whatever you want to really get. I mean, there's all sorts of options out there, and most of them are honestly pretty cheap for what you get. not bad at all. And I mean, like you said, like you're going to have the terminal up and you're like waiting for those people to sign up. And honestly, like, the customers that you do get, the most valuable thing you can do is talk to them, like actually have a conversation, be like, how are you using this product? Like, what do we need to build? That kind of stuff. You don't really have any problems at scale. You can, have your lawyer go drop a contract, and like you can do so much of this stuff manually that you really don't need that much tooling, and you can just run some of these sort of analytical queries either on like a read replica of your Postgres database, or if you're, feeling lucky, you can run it directly on it if you want to. I would say that if you like, once you if you get to the point where you're still in that first step, but you're getting enough data in to where you really want to like have some sort of analytical stuff going, then I would go to DBT Cloud. And I do want to spend some time talking about DBT just in general, because you can see how it's literally like the entire way through, because I really feel like DBT, what stands for Data Build Tool, is sort of the best choice you can make early on, because it can kind of help you with even data governance, or some of those things we talked about where people are getting different views of the data and that kind of stuff. It really help you like get all that stuff organized and scalable, right?
And just to pause there for one moment, for people who watch this video, I mean, DBT is a very common tool, but could you just give us a high-level overview of what does it do in the stack? We say data transformation, but maybe like a couple clicks deeper of an explanation of what it does.
Yeah, so high level, and then we'll go down. Basically they say it's like the T in your ELT process. It's all about data transformation. And really what it is an abstraction on top of SQL, which is one really nice thing about it, because it can be very familiar to analysts, data engineers. You don't have to know how to write code to be productive with DBT. And basically the way that it works is you can define data sources, like raw data sources coming in from, if you're using Stitch or you're getting data from a third-party app or whatever into your data warehouse. And then you can build models on top of that. And then the real key is you can then build models on top of that, on top of that. So you have this whole graph of models that's like a dependency graph that says like, well, this model up here came from like these models and these models and this. So you can see like the lineage of how that data came through. And what's nice about that is by building things up in a good way, and you can validate like, hey, this model is 100% good. The data is super clean. Everything's perfect. Now somebody can build on top of that without having to worry about, oh, like, is my source data bad? Yeah, like and they don't even have to know like all the complexities of how you got to that one nice model, because it's all, abstracted away from them, right? Now they can just build more and more useful things on top of it. Yeah, and I mean, there's a whole lot of other stuff with DBT. Like we could literally do a whole webinar on DBT, I think, and maybe we should. But yeah,
we should. No, that's great. Though I think if I had to summarize the perspective across the journey, that investment early on is, something that isn't required in order to have, a decent data stack setup at the first step stage, and maybe even the seed stage. But the early investment will pay significant dividends because you've already built a foundation of models for the business and modified those as the business has grown and changed, that will make future work a lot easier.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So,
okay, so we're querying Postgres and watching it live in our terminal. We're building some basic DBT models as we understand the structure of the business. Visualization.
Yeah, so visualization, again, I think this is where you can sort of, at least, especially first step, I think seed stage, you definitely need something. But something like Metabase, where it's not super expensive, because you're not going to be able to pay the, I don't know, 40 grand or 50 grand that, Looker might be, even though I do like Looker more than Metabase, but that's once you get to that scale, right? So with Metabase, the way I would approach Metabase too is to build your DBT models such that most of the queries that are sort of going through a Metabase are very basic. You really don't want to be putting complicated logic into a visualization tool like that. And even once you get to the looker stage, I would try to limit it. I would try to keep as much complexity at the DBT stage, because that's going to be the stage where the people who really understand the data the most are going to have the control over that tool and how that data gets generated. So if you're just doing in your data visualization tool, your queries become like select star from some table, where this, group by that, like that's pretty straightforward, right? Like you could move that to any different visualization tool. It's going to be really easy. But if all of a sudden you have like some complicated joins, and you're doing outer joins and cross joins and group bys with having clauses, and I don't know, all sorts of crazy stuff that you can come up with, like then all of a sudden you start to like, how do I even know that data is good? That could be crappy data. I don't know, right? So that's where I like, as you grow, I think me personally try to keep as much of that complexity in DBT so that it can be like vetted and be like, this is good, use this.
Sure, and you can avoid the rework. I mean,
right, exactly.
I've been in organizations where, you sort of start on BigQuery because you have Data Studio, and so you're just building all of these SQL queries in BigQuery that drive really good reporting, but then you get to the growth stage or the maturity stage, and you realize, like, goodness gracious, we basically have to overhaul literally everything, right? Or you want to migrate warehouses, right? I mean, I'm sure a lot of our listeners have experienced that, where it's just a huge amount of work to go back and do.
Yeah. We went from Postgres to Redshift at Heroku, and I think it basically took us like a year, especially because you think of all like it's not only like, oh, can I actually get the data over there and get the queries working and all that kind of stuff, but then it's like, more on the people and process things again. It's like, now you have to have like people who operate the stuff, and then like, hook everything up again to make it all work and make sure like it's good and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, that's definitely where, again, that's the whole point of this, is like, how can you build from the first step to bigger without killing yourself with a bunch of technical debt?
Sure. Well, let's talk about the next two pieces, and then we can talk about why we don't have SaaS options for the last two. So Event Stream. So talk with us about Event Stream. You're instrumenting telemetry in your website and app.
Yeah, exactly. And I think at this stage, like, you're not going to have a lot of customers. Like, you're probably not going to have like a ton of features that you need to be tracking all the different things about. So you're really just going to have fairly basic stuff, and having like a RudderStack free or whatever, just to like, okay, I can like collect that data. Especially on, like, me personally, I've like hated Google Analytics the more and more that I've used it. But being able to use that on like being able to use that on your website, in place of Google Analytics, like, not only do you have like more control over the data and all that kind of stuff, but you're actually able to get, like, unless you want to pay Google Analytics a bunch of money to get like really fine-grained reports, it's like with RudderStack, you can get like the very low level, like, this person viewed this at this time and they clicked this button and they did all that kind of stuff. So that's where, and then obviously, like, that then kind of builds your foundation for, and also like that company muscle memory of, like, when we release a new feature, we do put in a little bit of telemetry, and so that just becomes like the habit, right? It's not like, with Mattermost, we had to do a lot of like people work to work with the QA team, work with the engineering teams. Hey, you guys need to be putting in telemetry for all this stuff, and like, here's how you should do it, and like, here's the best practices and all that. I mean, it's not like it took us a year or anything, but still, that's like, if you can develop that muscle earlier, I think you can scale better. Totally. Set yourself up.
Yeah, I think I would describe that. We talked with someone who was a single founder building a product, and they had instrumented telemetry in their app, still very, very early stage. And so we were asking them, why, is there a lot of value there? Because you don't have a ton of data. And their response was great. They said, well, number one, I know that this is going to be valuable in the future, so I'm baking it in from the beginning. But number two, the limited data I do have, it goes back to something that you mentioned earlier, Alex, which is it really helps me understand which users I should talk to, right? Oh,
Right.
that person's trying to do something, right?
Yeah.
And I don't have statistical significance on feature adoption because I don't have enough data. But I can see at a very basic level, people are trying to do certain things, and I can notice, you have that gut feeling just looking at, non-statistically significant data around, I should probably talk to this person and see what they're trying to accomplish.
Right.
And then ETL, ELT, talk about that at the, and these are really similar for first step and seed stage. So talk about that setup for first step and seed stage.
Yeah, so I think for the first step too, like it's probably limited on like what sort of, I'll say like business tools you're going to need, like a HubSpot. You're not going to be using Salesforce. Gosh, what's that one? Amplitude or whatever. Like there's limited amount of tools that you're probably going to want to spend money on, because you're going to be spending money on like, running my servers, and maybe I need to hire somebody,
Sure.
or things like that. You're going to be using like Google spreadsheets or something for like leads or whatever, right? So once you do get to the point where you start adding a few of those on, you do want to get that data, and I'll kind of talk of this as like the end level and then sort of work our way back, because I think the end goal that big time data like we're about is like, data can get really, really, really valuable if you can really enrich it with everything from everywhere across the organization. So it's like, if you can have that customer 360 view with the sales, the marketing, the customer success, the product usage, just like give me the whole picture. And then all of a sudden I can start making people not only more efficient, but also, like the sales guy has more context, like how is this person using the product and
Sure.
all this kind of stuff. So having all that data coming into your data warehouse ends up being and really not only getting it into your data warehouse, but then also like connecting it across all these different systems. That really becomes the trick. That really opens up a lot of things. And I mentioned like pipeline wise, which is an open source Python tool that it uses Singer.io under the covers, which Singer.io is what Stitch data is built on. It's like an open source data format kind of thing. Pipeline wise is like a library. I actually do use it at Mattermost for just a couple of little things. But it's pretty nice. I mean, it's an open source, like there's not like a company behind it or anything like that. But I think also with, again, to sort of go the full circle for a second first, is like with something like RudderStack Cloud Extract, and then we'll get into the RudderStack Warehouse Actions. It's like, if you could have one tool that can get my data in, not only for my product and my website, but also like my Salesforce, my HubSpot, my Stripe, whatever, get it into the data warehouse, and then also do the extract. I think to me, that's where like RudderStack's full vision becomes realized. And that's like for any size thing. And that's what I've been, so, currently it's like, let's make that the real dream come true across all these things.
The dream, you mentioned at the beginning, your data engineering dream coming true.
Yeah, exactly.
I think if I had to summarize first step and seed, and let's talk about reverse ETL, because there's a lot of commonality. If we look at the first, or if we look at a lot of these tools, there's a lot of commonality, and I think we can briefly touch on why all this stuff scales really well. But I think in first step and seed, if you think about DBT, visualization tool, event stream, and the ETL piece, especially with DBT, event stream, and ETL, they're not critical, but it really seems like you're building muscle early on that will pay dividends in your velocity on using data. So even thinking about ETL, ELT in the first step stage, that might not be necessary, but man, if you can build a DBT model that combines event stream data and tabular data and have a decent starting point there, when you get to the growth and maturity stages and you've already done some of that work and worked out some of the issues as the business has grown and changed, it's, you can go multiple times faster than starting from zero.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And, going on to the reverse ELT thing, obviously, like when you're first starting out, it's like you can just hand, input data, manual data entry into some of these systems. It's like, okay, fine, you're doing like 2 leads a day or something into some marketing campaign, and in fact, most of the time you're probably writing custom emails to your customers being like, hey, I really want to talk to you, and stuff like that. So it's like, okay,
this
fine.
is the founder.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
For real.
Yeah, it's just me. And then, once you do get to that next stage, that's where it's like, okay, I actually need to like have some operational excellence around some of the stuff that I'm doing. And that's where like the reverse ELT gets into like RudderStack warehouse actions. And this space has been like just blowing up recently. So then you've got, Census, Polytomic, High Touch. I know there's probably tons more out there that I should probably know about too, but those are just sort of a list. And one interesting one that I do want to sort of talk about, and again, this is sort of on the maturity stage, but you see that Heroku Connect over there?
Yeah.
I actually like Heroku Connect, but like it's only for Salesforce. And you do have to use a Heroku Postgres database, which adds some complexity that's not necessarily where you want it to be. But of the tools for interfacing with Salesforce, it's probably the most advanced, but it also costs a ridiculous amount of money, like 75 grand a year or something, for like a basic whatever. And it's like,
sure.
You could think about it. I probably wouldn't, like, I wouldn't even recommend it, even though I like it at this point, because Salesforce is assimilating Heroku into its Borg, and that just isn't going to work out too well.
Sure.
But yeah, so with the reverse ETL, going back to what we were talking about with it before, is like being able to get, like, now that you have more data, let's say you're in the seed stage, it's like you have more of this data, you want to be, putting people into marketing campaigns or making leads for the salespeople or something. And if you can have those things automated, even at the seed stage, and especially at the growth stage, you'll need that. Just being able to like have things happen faster, right? It's like, oh, this customer is like started to engage with the product. We have a DBT transformation that says like, hey, this guy should be in this marketing campaign because they did XYZ things in the product. And then that goes and creates like a campaign, puts them in a campaign or whatever, and they get like emails, or maybe it goes to a salesperson or whatever, but
sure. From the warehouse, which is like, yeah, it's almost if you build those muscles early on and you're collecting this data in the warehouse and you do a good job on building out your DBT models, the reverse ETL allows you to mine the full value out of that data.
Exactly. Yeah.
So cool.
Yeah.
And okay, let's talk, sorry, go ahead.
The only other thing I was going to touch on was just like, not only doing that kind of stuff, but it also kind of builds that muscle of like, the data warehouse is the source of truth for everything. So then people aren't using all those other tools to like, get the wrong answer, or like somehow get, how users can do, they can mess any system up.
You're seeming to indicate that companies have experienced problems over customizing Salesforce, but I don't want to put words in your mouth.
Dude, I don't even want to get into all the crazy things I've seen people do with Salesforce. It is completely bananas because, it's just, yeah.
Another webinar. Okay,
we're up to 2 more after this.
2 more after this, DBT and Frankenstein Salesforce. Okay, I want to be conscious of time here to leave time for Q&A. So let's cover two things. So we've talked about most of this. When is it time to get a warehouse, right? And so you've identified Snowflake and BigQuery. We can pause on that discussion just because we'll do a 3rd webinar on that.
Yeah.
When is it time to actually implement a data warehouse? This is going to vary by company, but sort of seed stage to growth stage. And so what are some of the things that are clear indicators we actually need to go from, our Postgres or production DB? And then also, when do you need Looker? Like what are the markers where you say, okay, I need a warehouse and then I need Looker?
Yeah, that's actually good questions. So this is kind of a joke, but I feel like the first time that you break production because you're running some analytics query might give you a little bit of hint, like, hey, we need to be doing this a little bit differently.
Sure.
It also becomes when you want to start storing a lot of like historical snapshots of data and historical data for a long time so that you can see trends and things like that. Because, when you're running a production database, you want to get rid of stuff that doesn't matter anymore as fast as possible, just for, query performance and all that kind of stuff. So it's like, once you start hitting those limits of having that data there, it's like, hey, let's start thinking about a data warehouse. And I don't want to discount the idea of like, you could use a Postgres database as your data warehouse, quote unquote, if you wanted to, just not your production, like OLTP
Right.
transactional database, right? Like Postgres can get you pretty far that way. And then I think for like, once you get to like the bigger players, Snowflake and BigQuery, that's where you're starting to run into issues where just Postgres can't keep up anymore. Like it's trying to aggregate too much data. It just doesn't have it's not made for it, right? It's not really made for the analytical workflow. So it's like, okay, I really need to do that. And then from the sort of like, once you get to like the Looker stage, and I have a lot of experience with Lookers, so that's sort of why I tend to like it, is with the way that Looker does things with LookML, which is sort of a YAML type data format that sort of defines your data model. It not only gives you the data governance, because you can have your users in different groups and give them different permissions and stuff so that they can only see certain things. Like at Mattermost, we have like a board level view that's like kind of hidden away from other people, and stuff like, so you can do, interesting things like that. But then also it, gives you sort of that layer of, you're defining the data model and what people can basically query from the database. They can't just randomly run some crazy query. Like it's all sort of pre-baked and pre-built.
Sure. Got it.
And then that enables you to have like an interface for the users where they're basically like just dragging and dropping and doing that kind of stuff. And based on the way like Looker works, it writes it generates SQL for you, but it keeps them from, getting themselves into trouble with doing joins that aren't correct or whatever, because you're defining it all on the back end for them.
Very cool. All righty. Well, I think I'm going to do one takeaway, and then we're going to cruise through the rest of the slides so that we can have some Q&A time, because we've had too much fun on this journey. But I will say one thing that's pretty amazing is if you kind of look at this tool set, we live in an age where the tools are robust and scalable enough to sort of handle like a pretty wide-ranging journey in terms of company growth. And it's really about, the tools are great, and then how do you use them and implement them to build the muscles? Right. Okay. Quick note on B2C versus B2B. So the thought here, so I'll just make a couple comments and then you can make some brief comments. So B2C is generally heavier on tracking non-paid user behavior, and sort of doing like front of the stack stuff, right? So if you think about e-commerce, right? Tons of browsing behavior, product views, trying to analyze that to get to the moment of truth when someone makes a purchase. Gaming, similar, right? Huge amount of interaction data, sort of getting to the point where they pay. And of course, like there are important things about that experience, but that can influence cost, considerations, because it can be really expensive to track a high amount of non-paying users in terms of unit economics. And then B2B is generally heavier on the back end of it, right? Where you're sending a lot of data to SaaS applications that are used by internal teams. So that's, sales, marketing, product, data science, et cetera. And there's also a heavy emphasis on enrichment, right? So there's certainly really interesting use cases for reverse ETL and B2C. B2B is, doing mass enrichment at scale in the warehouse and then syndicating that out to just all these other cloud tools and systems that the teams are using. So those, I think, are the two things that came to mind when we talked about different business models. Anything you want to add there?
Not really. I think Heroku was an interesting business model that I'll just touch on, because it was like, you're selling to the developer first, and then you're trying to get into the enterprise, right? Like that was the whole engine that powered Heroku. So we sort of like dealt with both in that way. And I think there's a lot of companies that sort of do go that way, right? Where it's like you're sort of first getting like the developer persona to use your product, and then you want to like get them to sort of that enterprise, bigger kind of thing. But otherwise, all there.
Awesome. Okay, really quickly, we don't have I'm going to ask you one question on this, and then we'll do a fourth webinar. We're just lining them up here.
Yeah, right.
Thinking about the Datastack journey, how would you grow the team? So when do you hire a data engineer, and then how does that data engineer interface with the other teams in the company?
Yeah, that's a good question. And when do you hire the first data engineer? I mean, I would personally say, hire them like earlier than later, right? I think some people would try to like put it off, and I've seen a lot of companies where it's like, oh, this guy kind of knows SQL, so we just like had him do it, right?
Right.
Which honestly, if they pick the right tools, then they could probably get away with it and be like, okay. I think like building that like BizOps team that can really be the center of understanding all the data in the company, where it's coming from, and even more importantly, how it's being used and where it's being used, and understanding the nuance of how all that stuff works. That's where like the value of that stuff really starts to shine, because you can have the coolest data lake, data warehouse, whatever, with the prettiest things or whatever, but it's like then you need to have like the operational piece on top of it that's really using all this stuff to make it work. And as far is data first-class citizen in the company, I think it has to be at this point, right? Like we've reached that point where, your point earlier about like, we've reached this point of tooling where it's no longer like only the crazy Netflixes of the world or whoever who can deal with like all this crazy amount of data. It's like, you can pump a crap ton of data into Snowflake or BigQuery or whatever, and like you can reasonably query that stuff, provided you set it up right. But it's like, I think more people are starting to understand how to deal with all this data. And I think that's part of where RudderStack is like trying to help people with that. At the same time as like big time data, we're trying to do the same thing.
Sure. Awesome. Yeah, I would kind of file that under, probably earlier is better than later, and it's an investment that's going to pay dividends. Because if you start earlier, the team doesn't have to be massive because they're not doing cleanup work.
Exactly. And I mean, honestly, that's a huge thing. Like, we've even seen, companies where they have this big data engineering organization. It's like, well, if you didn't make these bad decisions earlier, you would only need like 2 or something and it would be fine.
Sure.
So, yeah.
Sure. All righty. Well, we have 5 minutes for Q&A here. Sorry, we crammed through the last couple of slides there, but more webinars to come. So please type your questions into the Q&A field or into the Q&A box, or raise your hand, and I can unmute you. And let me see here. With the Q&A box.
The Q&A box. I've never done one of these webinars before. It's so much fun.
You like it? You're famous now.
I know.
Okay, here's one that came in. So, we have someone who's raising their hand. Okay, let me. I'll unmute you in just a moment. Let's answer this first question really quick. How do you know, there's lots of new tools coming out. How do you know if you adopt something, if it's going to be around, right? Which is a really interesting question, right? Because there's, something came up on Product Hunt, and, how do you know to make the right investment?
Yeah, and I mean, that's actually, I feel like that's something like Big Time Data as a company is doing. Like, we're trying to vet all these different technologies and things so that we get into these, client companies, we can say like, hey, like we've actually had experience with this, and like we see, what the thing is. But I think, another thing you can think about is, well, again, and I'm going to preach the gospel of DBT again, is like with DBT, it's open source. So, they're not going to like shut down shop and you can't use it anymore. Right. So again,
Sure.
that's that thing of like, okay, maybe your reverse ETL tool goes away or whatever, but as long as you have all that data modeled in DBT, like there's 1,000 other reverse ETL tools to go,
Sure.
use that you could migrate to that really, all you're paying for with the reverse ETL tool is how do I get it from my warehouse to this thing? It's just like an API,
Yep.
it's like API interaction. So by having the data clean up front, that it just solves so many issues, right? Like
Sure.
a lot of stuff. So yeah, that's
Love
what
it.
I would say.
All right, I am going to unmute. Pascal, I think is how you pronounce your name. I would love to hear your question.
Okay, it's Pascal, not Pascal.
Pascal.
Yeah. So my name is Pascal. I'm primarily a software engineer from Lagos, Nigeria. So I work in a fintech company, a enterprise level to describe it as that. And so when I got in, right? So I've had a bit of background with data science, and then when I got in, so there was this like significant amount of data, right? But it wasn't. So a lot of it wasn't being, aside from since if it's a heavy IT company, they'll have like developers, so they would just be able to like put together dashboards to see through like transactions and stuff, right? So apart from all that, there wasn't like a lot of analytics going on, right? So and then I started to push for that slowly, right? So I'm trying to understand here, right? One of the things I'm trying to, I'm still trying to, because I'm trying to get the community to get to understand, one, the importance of data engineering, and then the importance of building a data culture, right? I'm trying to understand, particularly around where a tool like where, so some of the tools like you've mentioned, like where they would fit into helping me at this stage, right? So so some of the things some of the things I use lately is, for example, I built like something to monitor. So we have like on-premises servers, right? And then I use Airflow to like build like do like an ETL system that sort of pulls server data over daily, right? So using like Linux cron jobs, like so a bash command, right? I pull server data, then I wrote like an ETL pipeline that sort of moves that data into a database, and then I have like a dashboard that helps keep people to be able to understand what they're doing, what's going on in the servers, and how they're using servers, and where changes needs to be made. And then I was able to also spin up something related, where we are looking at like how people are using, the people who are users and how they are transacting over time. And then sort of trying to use that to monitor things, to look at things like churn rates and stuff. And so those are some of the things that I've been able to, some of the low-hanging fruits I've been working on lately, right? But one of the issues I'm struggling with lately is, figuring out the right tools at this stage, right? And the things to sort of work with, especially because currently I'm literally like, so I'm not officially a data engineer, but I'm like the only data engineer, right? And so I'm just trying to be sure that whatever foundation I'm building on is solid enough to that if anyone comes in, either when I'm still around or if I'm gone, it doesn't just fall apart.
Yeah, and that's actually an interesting case. I think that probably happens more than people would admit, as far as having sort of like a larger company not having the data expertise even at sort of like a later stage, and then it's basically like a skunkworks project that somebody like yourself is working on. I mean, again, I think like preaching the gospel of DBT all the time is like, as far as a foundational tool and being able to model that data, I think that's where you can really have some quick wins there. I think the other thing I would be thinking about too is finding the sort of leadership within your company and showing them some of the things that you've built and being like, hey, I built this thing, with Airflow, I've got DBT, I'm doing some ETL stuff, and showing them the value of like what you're building, right? Because then you can get the instead of it being sort of like a side project within your own job, it's like, you can be like, hey, I think we should really prioritize this. And we really need to, as an organization, get better about this stuff. So that's not necessarily like the technical answer to all your problems, but I think like using some of this technology, like the base foundation, and I think using Airflow is a good call too. We didn't really touch on it, but I love Airflow. But having DBT on top of that and being able to show them like, here's all this value that I can extract out of this data just by like this side project that I'm kind of doing as part of my job. Like, to me, that I think that's the way I would approach it.
Great. Well, we're going to wrap it up here. Thank you, Pascal, for that. Sorry, Pascal, for that question. And we're going to wrap it up since we're over the hour, but very quickly, two things. Number one, Alex, how can someone get in touch with you at Big Time Data if they have questions, or a potential project, or they want to evaluate a tool?
Yeah, you can email me it's alex@bigtimedata.io. And you can also just go to bigtimedata.io. Cool.
And of course, if you're interested in building pipelines out, you can visit RudderStack.com, sign up for a free trial, or send an email to me, Eric@RudderStack.com, if you have any specific questions. We've kept you long enough, but we have a deep bench of additional webinars in the wings now that we'll be bringing in the coming weeks. So, Alex, thank you for your time. Everyone, thank you for joining. And please email us questions if you have them, and we'll catch you on the next one.
Cool. Thanks, y'all.